seat for you.
Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Tony Penny, and I have the distinct honor of serving as the Chief Learning Officer here at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute. Before we begin our program, in honor of our men and women in uniform, please rise and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you very much. Please be seated. So in March of 1983, President Reagan was invited to speak to the annual convention of the National Association of Evangelicals in Orlando, Florida. A little bit of context for his remarks there. So in 1983, the United States and the Soviet Union, if they had to update their Facebook relationship status, it would probably say, it's complicated. The Cold War, decades of nuclear proliferation, military posturing, proxy wars, and two completely different systems of government vying for power and influence across the globe had driven a sizable wedge between the two former World War II allies. Fear of nuclear war between the two countries was ever present. As part of his remarks, President Reagan said, quote, "I urge you to beware the temptation of pride, the temptation of blithely declaring yourselves above it all and label both sides equally at fault, to ignore the facts of history and the aggressive impulses of an evil empire, to simply call the arms race a giant misunderstanding and thereby remove yourself from the struggle between right and wrong and good and evil. While America's military strength is important, let me add here that I've always maintained that the struggle now going on for the world will never be decided by bombs or rockets, by armies or military might. The real crisis we face today is a spiritual one. At root, it is a test of moral will and faith." He continued, "I believe we shall rise to the challenge. I believe that communism is another sad, bizarre chapter in human history whose last pages, even now, are being written." Our guest tonight is one of the folks who has set about composing those very pages. His book, The Brink, President Reagan and the Nuclear War Scare of 1983, is a deep dive into a set of NATO exercises called Able Archer 83 that led us to, as the title suggests, the brink of nuclear war. Marc Ambinder wears many hats: journalist, producer, author, professor, consultant, and according to the bio page on his website, a dabbler in motion graphics design as well. He's an adjunct professor of journalism at USC's Annenberg School, who teaches national security reporting, was a White House correspondent for the National Journal, politics editor at The Atlantic, and has worked with CBS and ABC News covering politics and policy. He also claims that his Wikipedia page is accurate, mostly. Margaret Thatcher said that Ronald Reagan won the Cold War without ever firing a shot. Well, in 1983, we came pretty darn close, and here to tell us more about it, please join me in welcoming Marc Ambinder to the stage.
No, that was great. Thank you so much. I was just saying as we're going about here, this is now the sixth time I've been to the library, but the first time I actually got to see the exhibits because I came here to cover several presidential debates. I came here as a researcher, which is a very different experience than coming to the foundation. So it was amazing to see the exhibits earlier. I wanted to start a little bit with, just to give people a sense of what the world was like for the Soviet Union, or the Soviet military in particular, during this NATO exercise. Ronald Reagan was at the time on a trip in Tokyo, and so you would think it would be a very unusual time if the US had suddenly decided to start a war for him to do so when he was overseas. But that, of course, would be our assumptions looking at what the Soviets were thinking and not what the Soviets were thinking looking at what we were doing. So just going to read a little bit. We're going to start off by going into the heart of the KGB residency in London, England. Oleg Gordievsky knew that something unusual was happening. 14 of his colleagues in the GRU, that's Russian military intelligence, stationed in the embassy were scurrying around like mice. Couriers bearing top secret cables from a communication station next to the embassy came in and out all day, and their work was so segregated that not even Gordievsky, who was part of the KGB, knew well enough, didn't know what was happening and knew well enough not to ask. The cipher clerk rushed out of his locked room with a flash telegram. A flash telegram was something that Gordievsky had never before seen. It had the highest precedence over all other communications traffic. A flash telegram meant pay immediate attention, and he remembers the gist of the text. The American exercise, this is Abel Archer, may be a cover for a surprise nuclear attack. Watch the signs and report immediately anything unusual, any signs of preparation, including the evacuation of the ambassador or family from the American embassy. The cable also noted that American bases around the world had beefed up their security. Gordievsky kept calm. What can we do, he would later say. We know some panicky people in Moscow were critical, but here we regard the situation sitting in a Western capital. Well, we don't see anything critical. Still, he said, I knew it was a dramatic moment. I knew Moscow was nervous. A separate version of that same cable went to the Soviets' allied intelligence agencies. Marcus Wolf, who was the chief spy master of the Stasi, sent a query to his best source inside NATO, its current intelligence officer, whose name was Rainier Rupp, codenamed Topaz. What's going on? Are we at the brink of war? Wolf waited for an answer. At the same time, this is November 8th or 9th, in Moscow, around Moscow, General Colonel Ivan Yesin, the commander of the SS-20 Pioneer Regiments for the Soviet Strategic Rocket Force, spent the night in a special bunker. Just months into his first assignment as a general officer, and here he was at ground zero of global nuclear conflict. NATO Pershing and ground-launched cruise missiles were deployed specifically to counter the missiles he supervised. Large-scale NATO exercises were fraught with danger because he believed that the Soviet intelligence assessments that the Pershing II warheads could reach Moscow within 6 minutes and decapitate the leadership. It was under the pretenses of those exercises that a sudden nuclear strike could be delivered, he later recalled. Since November 2, which is when Abel Archer began as the exercise began, his mobile regiments had been on alert, secretly. During peacetime, 10% of the SS-20 pioneers were forward deployed. That means they were deployed to wartime positions. During Abel Archer 83, fully half of them, about 75, had been moved to these wartime positions hidden by camouflage near mountains about 100 kilometers from their bases. Special radar absorbing paint covered all of them. Each missile in the regiment had 3 warheads on them with 200 kilotons of nuclear explosives on board. 15 Hiroshimas to the public is how Yesin characterized it. At that moment, if the order came, Yesin's men could have launched the missiles in 2 minutes and 30 seconds. During this period, every 6 to 8 hours, Yesin would receive a briefing from the GRU, and as the exercise with NATO reached its climax, the briefings increased. The commanders of his rocket regiments were in their command centers, kept in contact by radio link, and he kept in contact with his boss, the chief of the general staff, Marshal Nikolai Ogarkov, the equivalent to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff inside the United States. Yesin observes that Ogarkov spent at least one night in a special command bunker during Abel Archer. Skip ahead just a bit. Andrei Babian was a first-year cadet who attended the Military Institute of Foreign Languages in Moscow, and he was looking forward to a long November weekend that coincided with the anniversary of the October Revolution, which is what the Soviets would celebrate, when the Soviets would celebrate the advance of the Bolshevik seizure of power in 1917. For Babian, it just meant 3 days off, and for the first time since he had left for Moscow, he was going to see his parents. They had come to visit him all the way from the Republic of Georgia, so they came to Moscow to visit him. On Friday, November 4th, though, the school shut down, all of its gates closed, all of its cadets consigned to their barracks. All weekend passes were canceled. Quote, "No one would give us an explanation about what was going on, but they seemed really nervous." On Sunday, he was allowed to leave barracks, but he had to remain on the grounds of the institute. A military geography professor later clued him in. NATO was conducting military exercises, the professor told him, that might be cover for a first nuclear strike. So I'll stop there just to give a general sense from two different perspectives, from the perspective of a lowly cadet and the perspective of a very senior general, and then a perspective of a Russian spy, what was happening on the Soviet side as NATO was practicing this particular nuclear release exercise in 1983. What I was doing, incidentally, I was 5 years old, so I was probably going to school, completely unaware of any of this. And one of the questions I get all the time is, we in the United States, we certainly perceived that we could see the cultural attributes of this big conflict, but very few people ever actually felt a sense of peril. Mm-hmm. So it's hard to convince people that we ever got to the brink when people who lived through that time and who weren't in Europe, weren't in London, weren't in West Germany even, were experiencing something completely different. And certainly, if you were in the Soviet Union and you were in the military, you were experiencing something that at the time seemed pretty terrifying.
Yeah, so someone who was a 5-year-old when this happened, I'm guessing this didn't register, at home, you weren't talking about this.
Although, when the president visited Orlando, where I lived, for the NAE speech, the Evil Empire speech, I remember watching the motorcade on television. I remember the channel. I was WFTV Channel 9. I remember saying to myself, you know what? One day I want to ride in this is not some retrojected memory. I said, one day I want to ride in a presidential motorcade. Because I think it was the first time that I actually appreciated one, because I saw one on TV. So that was the germination of one of my lifelong dreams. And luckily, as a White House correspondent, you get to do that. So I did remember him actually visiting Orlando for that speech, having no idea of its significance at the time. Yeah. But that's my one human connection to that memory.
So what is, yeah. So as a White House correspondent, what is it about this story, and why did you want to write this book about this particular incident?
I've been interested in nuclear policy for a long time. I was trying to find a subject that, a question that could be answered by interviewing people who were still alive and by reviewing documents that could be declassified and some that already were. And this fit right into that time period, because most people who were participants in this exercise at a junior level are alive and kicking. Many of the politicians who served at senior levels certainly weren't. And there's a lot of documentation from the East German side and the Russian side that had been translated and declassified and hadn't yet been poured over. So I had seen a documentary about Able Archer, and it posed a lot of these questions. What actually happened? What was it that made the Soviets so nervous? Or were they actually nervous? Was this just a head fake, a grand head fake to sow dissension inside NATO? And how, if we actually came to the brink of nuclear war, did we pull back from that brink? And I realized at that point that writing a book could also, to answer some of these questions could also be a book that satisfied a lot of my sort of intellectual, itches and curiosities, espionage, intelligence, nuclear stuff, and spies, but it could also be a book about presidential character and the way that presidents interact with the nuclear command and control system, and presidents understand and appreciate and deal with the enormous power that they have over the nuclear arsenal. And so I started to look into it, and the more I looked into it, I began to talk to a few people and was very lucky to find some people who hadn't spoken about it before, who could give me, in particular, a ground's-eye view of what was going on, because I really wanted not just the perspectives from the high-level policymakers, but I wanted the perspectives of a 26-year-old Army captain in Germany whose job it was to be the custodian of these nuclear weapons and actually participated in naval archers. So once I found a few people like that, I was confident that I could at least try to write a book, and that's sort of how the process began. But it like a lot of things, it begins with one's general curiosity, and then there's a question to kind of narrow it down to a set of questions that you try to answer, and then 4.5 years later, after a long gestation period and a bunch of time spent here at the library, a book comes out, and I would venture to say that most of the questions that I had going into it, I answered, at least to my satisfaction.
Were there any particular people, you do a great job in the book of, as you mentioned, kind of zooming out and looking at the highest levels of government and the conversations that are going on there, kind of the mid-levels, the planning, and then like the zoom in really close. You talk about Lee Trollin, that Army soldier who's on the front lines in Germany and actually has the key and is participating in
the actual
Archer.
Nuclear key.
Yeah. Which were there any people you talked to? I mean, did you do some kind of interviews with Lee Trollin or some of the folks?
Yeah, I mean, I spoke with Lee Trollin. I spoke with a number of, I spoke with, in the book, everyone who is quoted. It was either someone I spoke to or spoke, has spoken on the record, and their words are on tape. I know some authors have a habit of trying to recreate conversations, and there are points in the book where I was not sure that somebody's memory was exactly correct. I mean, just as an example, Bud McFarlane has a memory of this time period that doesn't jibe up with the chronology. Not because there's nothing nefarious about it. It's just that he was doing a lot during this time period, and his memory of what happened when doesn't necessarily line up with the document. So a lot of what I do as a writer is trying to line up people's memories with documents and contemporaneous evidence. But when you're writing a book like this, sometimes serendipity just lands on you. I was on the 101 freeway in LA. Got a call on my cell phone. It was hands-free, and it answered, and I says, "Hi, is this Mark?" I said, "Yes." He said, this is Al Buckles. You got time to talk? Now, I was in the middle of the freeway, but Al Buckles was someone that I'd been trying to get in touch with for a long time, because he was the chief non-commissioned officer for the Strategic Air Command. Essentially, if you're familiar with military, the officers are the ones who run the show, and the NCOs, the enlisted guys, are the ones who know everything. And he was the guy who would essentially teach the officers everything there was to know about how nuclear weapons operated in 1983. And so when he says, you got time to talk, and you're in the middle of the LA freeway, you got to find a place. So I literally pulled over to the side of the LA freeway. I tried to get my car as far off to the side as possible so it wouldn't do a thing. And for the next hour and a half, I had my iPad with me so I could record, and I, of course, got permission to record the conversation, because California, one must do that, and recorded this hour-and-a-half conversation with him. Because if you listen to audio tape, you just hear all these cars going by. But Al Buckles was someone who had never spoken to the press before, I think in part because no one ever really asked him questions about this time period. And I was just very lucky to someone had said, "You might want to talk to this Al Buckles guy," and tracked him down, and he was, there were some things he was hesitant to say and didn't go into everything, but he gave me a really granular understanding of how the nuclear command and control system worked at that time. So, as a writer, you always have to be ready with your phone and a recorder, regardless of where you are, even if you're in the middle of a freeway like that. But without people like that, you couldn't. I don't think you could tell a story like this. It's just, you can write it and it would be a political science article, and I didn't want to do that. I really wanted it to be, and there are times, I was just discussing this earlier with someone, when it can read a little dense because there's a lot of stuff packed into it, but I really tried to keep the narrative pacing such that it reads like a spy novel, albeit one with a lot of details in it.
Yeah, actually, I mean, there's some great scenes. You talk about the spy novel aspect, and there's a great scene, and I'm interested to know how you got this story about the Oleg, when his cover is kind of blown, and he has to escape, right? And this is, I just thought, I was reading this, and it read like a fictional spy novel.
Well,
but it actually
luckily, he has written. There actually is a book. Another book about him just came out called "The Spy and the Traitor" by Ben McIntyre, which is a biography of his entire life. But he's written a couple of books where he's described his participation in Able Archer and in other things, and given several interviews. So in that case, I just had the luck of having a lot of material to work with and able to pull something from here and pull something from there and stitch together a narrative. But that's one of the things that it's one of the easy things that you get to do when you're doing something like this is people have done, for some of it, have done some of the spade work, and you get to draw from a feast of what's already been published. But one point that this new book, which I recommend, even though we're talking about my book, this new book makes is that of all the spies that spied for the West, his story is probably the most pure in terms of what his motives were. And he was the only spy, and the book, my book does describe his escape. He was the only spy that was ever successfully exfiltrated from Moscow by the West. Once he was recalled home because the KGB suspected correctly that he was spying on behalf, or he was spying for the Brits. And it really is and he's still alive. And it really is an amazing story. And look, the reason why he started spying was because he saw the tactics that the Soviets had employed against students in Hungary and Czechoslovakia, and he said, I could not live with that. And throughout every examination of his life, there's been no evidence. He refused to take money the entire time. I shouldn't say that. There were times when he refused to take any significant amount of money. He would occasionally, he would let sometimes his case officers buy him dinner, but he refused to take money. He just was giving information at considerable peril to his life and to his family. And luckily, he is still alive and in London. And again, story is totally pure, and it is told in the book. And he is sort of one of the heroes of the book because he spoke truth to power at a time when the British intelligence establishment and the American intelligence establishment, they didn't really want to hear that Moscow was actually really afraid of some of the stuff that the U.S. was doing.
So I want to build on that idea of the fear that comes across, because that's a consistent theme throughout the book, is this idea that the Soviets are incredibly fearful of America and their intentions, and that they're doing this military exercise. They think it's a cover for a first strike kind of decapitate attack. And on the other side, we have Ronald Reagan, who I think a lot of his opponents in the Soviets sometimes thought of him as this kind of saber-rattling nuclear cowboy. But he wasn't. He really did kind of earnestly want peace, and you talk about that in the story. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that discrepancy between the perception and the reality.
The quote from the Evil Empire speech, just to give some context for why he gave that speech. In part, the Republicans had lost a lot of seats in the election of 1982, the midterm elections, based on the idea that the president had really only had a one-tone policy toward the Soviet Union, and was pushing on Europe these missiles that Europe didn't want, and was being very aggressive about it. This speech was an attempt for Reagan to explain to the world but also to a domestic political audience, why specifically he believed in his policies, but also what the totality of his policies were. And people read different things into the speech. The people who were inclined to see Reagan as aggressive and militaristic, which included Democrats, and to be fair, a lot of the media at the time, and people in the Soviet Union focused on the evil empire line. But in the quotation that you read from the speech, and not just in that quotation, but in other parts of the speech, Reagan is explicitly clear in saying the Cold War will end, but it will not end with war. And he meant that. He wasn't entirely sure at that point how he was going to accomplish it, in part because, as he once famously said, the Soviet leaders keep dying on him, which was true. And there was inside his administration a lot of pushback against the idea that he needed to engage with them directly without somehow elevating them to his level. But he, and one of the consequences of this particular episode of Abel Archer and the intelligence that he received afterwards, and there was conflicting intelligence, and in fact, the intelligence community came out with an estimate in 1984 based on what Oleg Gordievsky, the British spy, had said, and a lot of other intelligence sources and items, and all of which are described maybe in too much detail in the book. But the intelligence estimate said, we're not sure. We know the Soviets did some unusual things, but we still think this is mostly just a head fake. But to the credit of the CIA also included dissenting opinions, and was very careful in their intelligence estimates to lay out all the facts and to point to alternative hypotheses. And Reagan picked up on the alternative hypotheses, and his diary entry the day after he read the special national intelligence estimate. In fact, part of it's still excised by the Reagan Library, I think in part because it refers to the classified estimate, which has itself been declassified. He said, having seen this, and he refers to George Shultz, I really concur with George. We really have to get moving and have to talk to them because it seems they really fear something about us. And Reagan, in his biography later on, would elaborate on what he meant. But at the time, he was realizing that there was something profound about the Soviets and the Soviet leadership and their fears and their intentions that he didn't understand, and that he needed to understand better. And significantly, that really pushed him to want to, for example, meet with the foreign minister of the Soviet Union, Gromyko, even though a lot of Reagan's national security cabinet was against that, saying, why would you meet, we're not going to meet with a foreign minister? That lowers you to his level. Reagan persisted because he believed to his core, and this, I think some of this stems from his background as a persuasive speaker for GE, his background as as an actor, as someone who, as a kid, as a lifeguard, saved 77 lives in one summer, very confident in his ability to persuade someone of something, and really wanted to get Soviets in a room and talk with them. But also throughout this period, and the book goes into detail about his learning process, the books that he read, the people that he consulted with, and the questions that he asked were not the questions of someone who knew the answer. They were the questions of someone who brought a humility to this grand question of what the Soviets actually felt. And whatever you associate Ronald Reagan with, normally humility in this area is not something that you do, but I think it's one of his most effective presidential qualities. It's like it's a word that actually puts meat on the bone of what it means to have character as a president. And so in the book, I describe his evolution in this area and how he processed the intelligence and what he thought about the intelligence, and how he also understood and really came to understand at this time that as president, he has a unique position of power over the nuclear arsenal and what to do with it. that the Defense Department might be pushing in one direction and have all these policy considerations. But ultimately, just as he could build a political consensus inside the United States, he could use his political skills to build a global consensus, which he ultimately did, and that is the reason why we have so many fewer nuclear weapons in the world today.
I want to continue to talk a little bit about President Reagan's character and both, I guess, his intellectual understanding of the impacts of nuclear war, but also his emotional kind of standing. There's a passage in the book where you talk about one of his first briefings that he had as president. He asked how many Americans would die under the assumption of current war plans, and they told him 150 million people. So when you look at like what's at stake, if we get to the brink of Able Archer, and if it goes wrong,
right,
we're talking literally hundreds of millions of people across the globe potentially being killed as part of this. Why was it that he had such an emotional connection? I mean, a lot of what I read in your book is that emotionally he didn't want that to happen. He saw, he was influenced by the TV special on ABC.
On ABC, right? They called The Day After, which was, again, if to the extent that there was awareness of nuclear peril during this period, it was in the scientific community a sense that nuclear winter after a thermonuclear war was real. And again, just in the way that it does today, television played a rather significant role in trying to inform the cultural limits or boundaries of what the debates were. On both sides, there were this is the era of Rambo movies, red versus, the Reds, the commies versus, but also of the Day After, which was based, on what would happen or what happened the day after a nuclear explosion near, I think, Kansas City. There were a couple of reasons for that. One is that Reagan had an abiding. He'd been interested in and disagreed with the main thrust of nuclear philosophy for years. I mean, he first met Edward Teller, who was the creator of the hydrogen bomb back in 1969, and him and Edward Teller got into a discussion about why there was, scientists weren't working on a shield that could, shield the globe from the which were then pretty new intercontinental ballistic missiles. So he had been thinking about something akin to Star Wars for 15 years by that point. In 1979, as a candidate, he visited NORAD, and he asked the general in charge of NORAD, all right, so what do you do if they fire at us? And he was told, we fire at them. And this is not what he exactly said, but this is the gist of the conversation. And his response was, but what do we do to protect ourselves? Nothing. Silence. As you all know, Reagan was a deeply religious man. The subject of his religion, I still think, it's a subject for a definitive book which has yet to be written because it's a very, very complex subject. And one of the questions I get all the time is, how does his belief in a brand or a variant of Christianity that was convinced of the literalism of the Bible and the idea that we were headed into the end times? Reagan had read Hal Lindsey's book, The Late Great Planet Earth, and believed that biblical prophecies could be true. How do you reconcile that belief with the belief that you could actually do something in the world? Well, you have to look at Ronald Reagan as a complex human being. For him, and he told this to a cardinal who visited him right after the assassination attempt. He said, when he was in the hospital recovering and knew that he would live, he said, I kind of know what my mission in life is now, which is I got to save the world from nuclear weapons. He believed that even if the world was ending, it was his duty to do everything possible to save as many people as possible from the impending death. That didn't mean to convert them all to Christianity. It simply meant to save their lives. That, I think, was the foundational impulse of what he wanted. And again, his religion is a very, very complex subject, and I certainly, couldn't do it justice in the book, and wanted to, and actually exorcised about 15,000 words on it, trying to figure out, because I couldn't come to any conclusion about the role that it played, other than it played a very, deep and significant, and maybe that's the answer. I mean, it played a role that we may never know. We would never be able to describe in 2 or 3 sentences, which may well be the point of it. But so I would say that, but at the core of it was a conviction informed by his religion that he had a duty to save the world, and that he had the gifts to do so, and God had endowed him with a gift. And this wasn't this really in his mind wasn't I'm the most unique person in the world. It was, I've been given this duty and burden to do what I can to reduce the nuclear threat and to end the Cold War and make the world safe from nuclear weapons, and that's what I'm going to do.
And as you describe, and one of the reasons we get to the brink is he wants to do that, but has trouble connecting and making the Russians understand him. I'd love to talk about that point of the brink and maybe a little bit of what leads up, because as we're getting closer to the Able Archer exercises,
right,
there are other things that are happening contextually that kind of ratchet up
right.
the
I
tension.
mean, if it just had been one exercise, the countries have been exercising their militaries all the time and still are. The U.S. is actually in the middle right now of the biggest exercise, NATO exercise it's ever held. And a lot of the rhetoric that you hear from Russia is, you can go back and it's the same type of rhetoric. I mean, there is always a, and this just, you can call it the choreography or the pantomime of nuclear deterrence that happens. Not to say that there aren't real consequences, and we can maybe, that's a subject for another day. But there's a lot going on, and it does get back to one point. I won't go into nuclear doctrine too much, but the U.S. nuclear policy doctrine had changed and advanced to the point by this period where the U.S. believed it had the technology and the means to fight a limited nuclear war, limiting it to just Europe, and win it on its terms without the U.S. suffering much in the way of casualties. This was based on it's a nuclear posture review that, of course, given in the United States, we have a free press, so it leaked in the New York Times, but it accurately reflected nuclear planning inside the United States. The Russians believed it. They also had their nuclear weapons were far less accurate and of a far more degraded quality than the U.S.'s. So their nuclear doctrine would be essentially, at that point, a massive, if the other guy's going to hit us, we're going to hit them first. So put yourself, first of all, in that mindset. You're always looking for signs that they're about to do something. That's the Soviet mindset. You're in that mindset because that's where your nuclear weapons are, but also because you're spending 70% of your economy on defense, and you realize that you can't do that for much longer. Your military is stretched thin around the world, deployments in Afghanistan. Public opinion around the world is sort of swung against you. You have a charismatic president of the United States that is popular and seems to be uniting NATO, which had always been very, very fractious, although there's some debate about whether that was happening. And then you have a series of events in 1983 that really begin to scare the Russians on a visceral level. You have naval exercises, which were very aggressively pursued, which included flying fighter bombers that could have had nuclear warheads on them to the edge of Soviet territory and then zooming back, or sometimes actually violating Soviet airspace and coming back. This was during fleet exercises, a Fleet X-83 in 1983. You had the Star Wars speech, which Soviets had no idea what to make of. They thought that it was some sort of cover for maybe an electronic warfare attack. You had the downing of the Korean airliner KAL-007, which in part, the reason why the Soviet air defense system was on high alert was to counter some of the aggressive U.S. Navy moves several months earlier. And so the permission given to their fighter pilots to actually strike was sort of, the permission threshold was lower. You had an incident where the Soviet version of NORAD detected 5 incoming ballistic missiles. And although the story that's told now is not apocryphal that one guy named Stanislav Petrov saved the world. He, it really was his call to say, I don't think this is real, but he had no way of knowing whether it was real or not. He could have, the call that he would have made essentially would have been to wake up Soviet leaders and then get the Soviet version of nuclear command and control system up and running on a 5-minute alert, and he decided not to, but knowledge of the fact that there had been a glitch in the system and that seemingly missiles had been on the way, that spooked the Soviet Union. There were a number of indicators they had been preparing. There had been, and I would say overlaying all of this was the project of Yuri Andropov, who was convinced for a variety of reasons that it was the ultimate strategy of the West to launch a surprise attack to gain back territory in Europe that would include the use of nuclear weapons. And so in 1982, he had secretly made it a priority for the GRU, the military intelligence, and the KGB to collect intelligence based on the assumption that that was what the US wanted. You can see, if you have any sort of sense of how intelligence works, the problems in doing that. But there was the program was called Ryan, Project Ryan, or V Ryan. I won't try to transliterate the Soviet word for it, but it translated essentially into surprise nuclear attack. So for a year and a half before this, you had every intelligence officer in the world looking for signals that the US or NATO was planning for an attack. They weren't looking for signals and trying to interpret them. They had an interpretation for whatever they found. And a couple of very small, subtle things could have a lot of changes. One was the change in communications procedures for nuclear weapons. And so knowing that Able Archer was an exercise where these procedures would be tested, the Russians were on the lookout for any sort of change to the procedures. Although they had really good spies, their spies did not tell them that the procedures actually had been changed. And during this period, when they started to monitor through various mechanisms, and the degree to which the Russians had actually broken into some of our nuclear command and control systems in Europe is still an open question. They were able to get a lot. How much they understood was again, is still an open question. But they saw things in these nuclear procedural messages, even if they couldn't interpret them, in their length, in who they were going to, in how frequent they were, that fit the criteria for, okay, the West is about to strike. So all of that kind of comes to a head right at the beginning of November in 1983, which is when this exercise is. And I'll just say one other point about the exercise in the press, because exercises were almost usually announced in the press. It was called a command post exercise, where bases would be communicating with each other, and that would be it. But that wasn't what happened during Able Archer. What happened during Able Archer was, for the first time, not only were the procedures exercised, the writing of the decoding of the messages that were coming in, but actually the mating of dummy warheads to actual missiles. We know now that the Stasi, the East Germans, and Russian special forces, the Spetsnaz, had observers in West Germany all around the nuclear bases, and were seeing in real time the mating of the warheads to the missiles, not knowing whether these were actual warheads or dummy warheads. If you were looking for signs of an impending first strike, those were signs of an impending first strike. So as in the Soviet Union, what do? You put your regiment secretly on alert. You disperse your leadership. You send KGB officers down into bunkers with guns and special keys. The KGB essentially had special keys that if the Soviet version of ICBM, if their ICBM missileers refused to turn the key, the KGB officer would shoot them and turn the key. You start hedging too, and that's the brink. When you're making these hedges based on fear and assumptions, but you're moving your nuclear command and control apparatus closer to the point of going off. And that's exactly what happened during this period.
And was there, You also talk about, obviously during that time, there's a lot of turnover in the Russian leadership.
Yes.
As Reagan said,
Right.
leaders
On
keep
that high
dying.
level, right.
Yeah.
And on the high level, there was actually no, in the military as well, there was but yes, before Andropov, who at this time was dying of kidney failure and was in the hospital most of the time, the U.S. had a source who was a nurse in the hospital, so they could always tell when Yuri Andropov was in the hospital for kidney dialysis or kidney treatment. I'm not sure if it was dialysis treatment, but he was dying. So if you're a leader who knows that he is dying, and you also have on your mind the fate of your entire populace, you are also going to be thinking in apocalyptic end of the world terms. And this was Yuri Andropov until early 1984 when he died, only to be replaced by another very old Soviet, very sort of old Soviet member of the Politburo, who Reagan just had no chance of working with. And then finally, Gorbachev comes in, and as Reagan famously said, well, now here's someone I can work with, in part because Gorbachev went to England first, and Gorbachev, being very, very smart and having very smart advisors, it later came out, knew that if Gorbachev were to impress Margaret Thatcher, and Reagan knew that Thatcher was impressed by Gorbachev, Reagan would warm up to Gorbachev very quickly, which he did.
The thing I was, and we'll go to audience questions in just a minute here.
Sure.
But one of the things I was fascinated by was the research you did where you start sharing what happens in the event of a Russian strike on the U.S. if they're able to take out, say Washington, D.C. or the head of our government. The plans that we had in place for all of a sudden you have is almost like a roll of the dice determines what becomes the new capital, who's the new head of government, and
right.
has kind of that nuclear control. Do you mind talking just a little bit about that? If I'm
yeah, I'll actually I'll rehabilitate a little bit of Oliver North's reputation. At the beginning of this period, the PSYOP, the actual nuclear war plan, and the execution, the launch codes, were so widely distributed in the military. If you just think about how a nuclear war has to operate, it would make sense. And Oliver North realized this and started an internal effort inside the National Security Council to at least make the argument that, look, we understand that we might have to devolve power, but let's at least devolve it to officials who are in the actual chain of succession and not in the military. Incidentally, when people talk about this time and his role in it, they always accuse him of literally the exact opposite, of trying to push military control over pre-delegation nuclear weapons and not basically saying, look, let's at least, even though it's not really constitutional, but let's at least keep the civilian line of succession in. So beginning in late 1982 and continuing for a period of 5 or 6 years, because it took a long time for this project to be put into place, and ultimately, although vestiges of it still remain, but the idea was that the presidency could be anywhere at any time. All you needed was essentially, enough food, a communication suite that would allow you to communicate with the American people, with allies, and with the world, and the requisite documents that you would need as president. And essentially, whomever was there or was left after a decapitation strike just would be acting president and would have command and control over the nuclear weapons. So there were a couple of locations around the country where a bunch of convoys of trucks with lead-lined trucks with very sophisticated communication systems and repositories of food were pre-positioned and would just kind of roll around the country at different points. And the National Military Command Center, in theory, if there had been some signal of an attack, would randomly evacuate a presidential successor someone in the line of succession to literally someplace that a computer would spit out. If the computer spit out, Tupelo, then the trucks would go to Tupelo, and that's where they would be. The point being that it would be much less likely for the Soviets to attack Tupelo. So the book goes into that in a little bit more detail, including having one of the authors of the plan admit that it wasn't exactly constitutional, but what are you going to do? You need someone, and it's a little bit better to have at least someone who is in the constitutional chain of succession making those decisions than leaving it to the military and devolving all of that authority to them.
Excellent. Then I'll ask one last question, and then if anybody has a question from the audience, we have members of our team who have microphones. But what lesson, is there a big kind of takeaway or lesson that you want your readers to get from this book?
Well, this is this hard question, because I was telling you earlier that, one of the obvious questions you get is, well, how does today compare with back then? And what people are actually asking is, how does the current president compare with it? And I stay away from that. Although, I can give a couple of very easy answers. But and the book does, in the epilogue, talk a little bit about that. One lesson is that the nuclear command and control system is an enormously powerful machine that really only presidents have control over and have to assert that control over in terms of the policies that they make. And it is designed to go off. It's essentially, people like to use the metaphor of a button. I like to use the metaphor of the president as being the trigger catch, the catch on the trigger, which makes it even more scary if you kind of think about current phenomenon. But what all of that means is that when you're dealing with countries that have nuclear weapons and you're dealing at this level of, the stakes are very high, you have to be very, very careful, and you deliberately have to slow down decision making, I think. And there has to be some sort of a check, a presidential check. So presidential temperament, to me, matters a lot. A president who doesn't have the temperament to slow down that decision making, and I'm really not trying to make anything about today's environment. It's a sort of a natural lesson that comes out of this book. But so that one lesson is that when it comes to dealing with this conception of anything nuclear, which we attach, it's a magic word we don't know how to deal with. The best way to deal with it is with humility, number one. Number two, understanding that there will always be things that you absolutely don't know about your adversary and that you need to find out, and that they might be acting in a way that you can't quite understand, and you have to assume that there are reasons for them doing things, and you can't simply act on the basis of your belief as to what they're doing. I would also highlight the importance of spies and of really good intelligence, because at several junctures during this period, it was the truth told by spies, risking their lives, that ultimately, when it made their way up to policymakers, was what made the ultimate difference and changed policy in a way that saved lives, probably, and is the reason why we're still here.
Excellent. All right, so we've got a few minutes for questions. If anybody in the audience has a question, please raise your hand. So we'll start here, and then we'll go there.
It seems he was rattling sabers. It sounds scary.
Yeah.
Was he trying to be provocative, and wasn't that really reckless?
President Reagan at times?
Yes.
There's no question that his rhetoric was alarming in a real way to the Soviet Union. I would say that his rhetoric was less alarming than actions that the U.S. military took, that he had some control over because he set the tone for it. There's no question that President Reagan was responsible for helping to ratchet up some of these tensions. To his credit, when he realized it, he was also responsible for bringing people back. So his impulse was, and some of it was also based on, again, the intelligence he had and the advice that he was getting, and his impulse was to show strength. He did not want to show weakness or vulnerability. But that's different, ultimately, than showing humility, which is what he ultimately did. But there's no question, in part to satisfy domestic politics, in part because he was sincerely convinced that communism was truly evil, and evil in Ronald Reagan's mind meant evil from the devil, evil from on a supernatural level. And he had a very visceral reaction to things that the Soviets did that he found was evil. So he was acting true to himself, but there were times when absolutely his rhetoric was not conducive and helpful and did inflame the situation. No question about it. At the same time, and the book goes into that, at the same time, shows him capable of realizing that, which is, again, a degree of insight that I don't think even people, it's interesting, you read the books that historians who are, are entirely favorable to President Reagan, they don't want to admit that he has vulnerabilities or even humilities because they think it's a sign of weakness, and it's the reverse, I think. I think it actually, in this case, is what helped propel him towards actually making a significant difference in terms of diplomacy. But no question, not going to sugarcoat it. He was responsible in part for the tensions that were built up.
We had another question right here in the second row, I think.
Hi, thanks for speaking.
My pleasure.
Question.
Yes.
Since you've written the book, finish the sentence. I was most surprised to find out.
Oh, gosh. That is a really, really good question. I was most surprised to find out how, at various moments in 1984 and 1985, President Reagan fought back against the Pentagon and took control of changes in nuclear policy, saying we're not doing this, or or literally saying we're not going to do this program, or we're going to delay this program because I want to do this. I was surprised to find out, based on declassified cabinet record where you could see him making these arguments, how he would steer those discussions. It's just not something that, and it gets back to the sort of humility point earlier, it's just not something that comes up even in a lot of the positive biographies of him. I was also really surprised by how scary some of the secret electronic warfare programs the US had that were designed to brick the Soviet command and control system, and how advanced some of those programs were, to the point where, we were talking about, there are details of those programs, even this was 35 years ago, I had to run by people who were still serving because I didn't feel comfortable putting them in the book because they might still be programs. In fact, some of them appear to be operational, at least vestiges of them. So I was surprised by how advanced some of those programs, that's a good question though. I got to prepare for that question the next time I'm asked it. That's a good question.
I think we had another one right here.
So the great philosopher Mike Tyson once said, everyone has a plan until they're punched in the face.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, with respect to our nuclear command and control,
Yeah.
how effective is our response going to be after a surprise punch in the face? Because it seems unrealistic to me that any person with 30 minutes notice at the most could make a decision or start the chain of decisions to launch a global nuclear war from our perspective.
This is the enduring question. And in some ways, it's best left open as a question, because it's a question that I would want every voter to ask of every presidential candidate aggressively. Look, there's so many things going on in the world now, it's hard to get people to focus on some of these, but that is the question. I mean, it truly is, and it's essential. And Ronald Reagan's answer to it was, I got to get rid of nuclear weapons. And there was one point, it's mentioned in the book, and certainly other books go into it in much more detail, where he was willing to say, let's just get rid of everything. He truly understood that really the only way to answer that question is to get rid of everything. There's a disturbing, though, development. I know we're getting to the end of our time, and I won't get into it in too much detail, but the concept of nuclear deterrence in the past 20 years has changed to the point where our nuclear weapons are getting, in terms of our ability to dial down their yields, their ability to control radioactive release, the ability to make them actually attractive as something that a president might use without much consequence, which of course is the foundation of deterrence. We're getting to the point where if a current president wanted to, say, take out Bashir Assad in a bunker, might choose a nuclear weapon to do it with, and might be able to get away with it in some realm without triggering, or at least thinking that they won't trigger some massive response from the other side, because our weapons are getting that accurate, and nuclear weapons in particular are getting, again, we can dial the yields down. And that really worries me. I'll just say this, it's not a popular point, but I wrote an op-ed recently where I made the point that the START Treaty, the new START Treaty, which is incredibly important, the only way that President Obama could get that through the Senate was to essentially sign the purchase order for a $300 billion upgrade of the entire nuclear establishment, making all of the weapons that we have much more accurate, much more deadly, much more stealthy, and more attractive for future presidents to use. Obama's team, well, they did not like that op-ed when it was published because they're very sensitive about that part of his legacy, and I can see why. These are not easy questions, and that remains to me the hardest question to answer, because there is no satisfactory answer other than we get rid of them all, which realistically we can't do. So we have to keep asking it really, really loudly, I think. One more question, Tembi? Or you want to end it? Or it's up to you?
Sure. So we do one more?
Or not, you can end here. Well, okay.
Got one more.
One more question.
Your
to that.
last one.
I guess it's a question more about the Abel Baker thing. You kind of touched on it.
Able Art, yeah.
Now, wasn't the whole thing with that apparently that almost set the whole thing off was the fact that the Soviet system had a glitch in where those missiles that they thought they were being fired at them.
Yeah, this was a different.
Were they actually armed and ready to go? Or?
No, this was a different. That was a different incident that happened about a month and a half earlier. The Soviet satellite systems were interpreting essentially the glint of light off of a cloud as an ICBM. You don't want your early warning systems to do that. But this was just but they were made very nervous by the fact that their early warning systems probably couldn't tell the difference between clouds and ICBMs, which also, again, if you think about it, part of real deterrence means that you have to have confidence in these systems, and they didn't. Let me just take the opportunity, though, to thank all of you for coming out and for listening to me pontificate on this subject. When you spend 4 years, 4.5 years sitting in a room, and coming here occasionally and sitting in rooms and really trying to figure something out, and able to get something out and talk about it, and people are willing to listen and ask excellent questions. It's very gratifying for an author. So thank you very much for coming, and I really, really appreciate it. So.
Yeah. And just so everyone knows, you're going to be signing copies of your book
Sure.
right after we're done. So if you want to get a copy or two, the holidays are coming up. If you like stories about Ronald Reagan, this book's for you. If you like the Cold War era spy stories, this is for you. If you like stories about nuclear chain of command, then this is a good story for you. So please feel free. If you have other questions, you can come up and ask them while you're getting your book signed. So thank you very much. Mark.
Thank you.
Yeah.